everyone, and welcome to this fifth session in our course on the access to decent work for refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. And as we had already anticipated at the end of the last session, in the webinar today, we're going to focus on fundamental principles and rights at work in the context of forced displacement. And specifically, we're going to look at two elements, forced labor and child labor. And we're going to be doing that in the company of ILO colleagues, but also colleagues from different organizations that hasn't been present in the course so far, from FAO. And it's my pleasure to have the three speakers today as part of the course. So as you can see on my screen already, because it's I think it's already showing the first slide of the presentation, of the first presentation that we will have today, we have our colleague Alix Nasri, who is Labor Migration Officer at the ILO, based in Geneva. And then we have two colleagues from FAO, Ariane Genthon and Francesca Pastorelli. Alix is going to give us a little bit of context about fundamental principles and rights of work, a little bit more in general, and then zoom in on the issues around forced labor in displacement contexts, while Francesca and Ariane are going to focus on the child labor dimensions of the presentation today. As you know, the sessions are being recorded, and then the recording is going to be posted on the eCampus afterwards. So if you have any connection issues, if you need to leave early, or if you would simply just like to go back and rewatch the sessions, you'll be able to do that. And then at the end of the session, we're also going to share copies of the presentations in PowerPoint for you to review and download from the eCampus in order to prepare, to review the material, of course, but also to prepare for the weekly quiz, which will be unlocked on Friday. As you know, as well, this is usually a relatively small group of participants joining us for the live sessions every time. So we try as much as possible to keep the different sessions as interactive and as engaging as possible. And in that spirit, please feel free to share your comments, your questions, your reflections, either by using the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, by using the reactions or the raise hand function at the bottom of the Zoom screen if you would like to take the floor to ask a question or share a reflection. Our speakers are also going to ask you questions, so feel free to respond and to participate directly. We will do our best to make sure that the conversation is lively and inspiring as well, hopefully, for you. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor directly to Alix. Thank you very much for being here, Alix. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and it's a big pleasure to be with all of you virtually today to discuss this really important topic of fundamental rights at work and some of them more specifically. So please, really, this is foreseen as an interactive session, so don't hesitate to come in and take the floor. First of all, I wanted to ask if you are already familiar with what we mean by fundamental rights and principles at work. Do you know what are those rights? Are you familiar in your work with those rights? Any thoughts on this? What are fundamental principles and rights at work? It's kind of a jargon also in the ILO, and it's a long term, so we're going to unpack it a bit. Any idea of what are those rights? I see right to wages. That's an interesting one.
Let's make a bet. I'm sure Anna could tell us something about this. I'm trying.
Employment contract. Thanks,
okay,
Marion.
because Anna is one of our top speakers during the webinar. So
okay, so I can basically maybe tell that this is a good also life-work balance that employers, so that this is also the right of everybody, like to contribute to the organization, but also like usually at the jobs we see so obligations and also like so requirements, and therefore so usually also the companies are posting and saying so what the employee will receive, and usually among all this that employee will receive, usually you will see their right to annual leave, so the working hours, so then I would say the team spirit, and yeah, so of course wages were already mentioned, so I would say that this is the general environment, if I can say like that in the simple words, not in legal terms, if I'm right.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing this and those different very important labor rights of workers. Anyone else before we dive in some of them more specifically? At the ILO, when we mention fundamental rights, for us, we think it's kind of the human rights of the labor rights, if you want. It's really the core of the labor rights. And so, in fact, many of the different rights that you mentioned are linked to what we will see. But when we speak about fundamental rights, we refer to 5 big topics in international labor standards. And I mean, fundamental instruments, fundamental conventions and protocol, there are 11 of them, and they focus on 5 topics. The first topic, which is a fundamental right, is the freedom for workers to associate and to collectively bargain. And we have 2 conventions that guarantee those rights, which are Convention 87 and 98, that speaks respectively on freedom to organize and then freedom to collectively bargain. Then the second very important right is freedom in a way. It's to be free from forced labor. So to make sure that forced labor is penalized, and both privately imposed forced labor, but also state-imposed forced labor. We have 3 instruments on forced labor: the Forced Labor Convention, which is one of our oldest convention, Convention 29, which has more recently, around 10 years ago, been complemented by a protocol, Protocol 29, and our Convention 105 that deals more specifically with issues of state-imposed forced labor. Then the third very important right, fundamental right, is the abolition of child labor. No one should be in child labor. And here there is 2 conventions, one which sets really the minimum age for employment, and the second which is specifically on how to eradicate those worst forms of child labor, including trafficking in persons of children, child soldiers, child prostitutions, etc. Then the fourth topic is the elimination of discrimination in employment, with 2 very important conventions, one on equal remuneration between men and women for work of equal value. So really this very important fundamental principles of equal remuneration. And a convention that looks at the elimination of discrimination based on different grounds in employment. And lastly, and this is quite new because this was added to the list of fundamental rights just a few years ago, it's the right to have a safe and healthy working environment, or we called it OSH sometimes, in professional settings. And here we have 2 conventions that are fundamentals: the Occupational Safety and Health Conventions that, mandate countries to adopt national policies on occupational safety and health, and also the Promotional Framework for Occupational Safety and Health Convention, Convention 187. So these are the 5 big themes, if you want. of those human rights of the labor rights. And what is interesting is that, in fact, fundamental rights, they are referred to, for example, in the ILO guiding principles on access of refugees and FDPs to labor markets. They are referred to several times in the guiding principles. So they are really the core of international labor standards. Now, do you know what is so special, except the fact that these are, if you want, the basic, the basic labor rights? Do you know what is so special about those 11 different conventions and protocol? They have a specificity compared to all the other protocols and conventions of the ILO. Any idea? They are quite special because in 1998, we adopted a declaration on fundamental principles and rights at work that was later amended in 2022. And what it basically says is that only for those 11 instruments, even if a member state has not ratified this convention, they will have to report every year in what we call the annual review, how they are actually implementing this convention. So what we are often saying, to countries is that, in a way, you have engaged as an ILO member in this, annual review procedure. So you have to explain what you are doing to actually give effect to those 5 big topics, even if you have not ratified. So this is also an argument for ratification because, okay, you are not, the subject to, the regular review system by the ILO supervisory system, but you still have to report every year what you do to actually make this a reality for workers. So this is what is very special. For all the other conventions of the ILO, if you do not ratify, you do not have to report on progress to be made. But on those very specific rights, because they are seen as such important, you have to do it. And the important thing is that they apply to everyone, every workers, obviously, including, refugees and IDPs. So this is the core of labor rights that apply to everyone and that are extremely important in situation of displacement because they are a bit this safety net, those really basic rights that are the minimum labor standards in a way. Do you have any ideas in your experience on why those 5 topics, no forced labor, no child labor, freedom to organize and collectively bargain, safe environment, and no discrimination are particularly important for refugees and IDPs in your experience?
I think here I can add better. So maybe because I would say that the main thing for refugees is that usually they are not granted work permit and usually they are not accepted equally and they face various discriminations. So starting from any stages of the employment process and finishing with compensation, wages and all other benefits. So that's just a quick reaction.
No, that's an excellent point. I think you are suggesting that they are really particularly at risk in terms of irregular situation of work, in terms of discrimination, you mentioned. So in terms of several of those rights, in fact, they are more at risk sometimes that's, other workers and they deserve specifically, those protection. Indeed, what we see is that refugees and IDPs are often at higher risk of exploitation in terms of forced labor, child labor, discrimination, occupational safety and health. very difficult sometimes to have the right to organize, because if you're in an irregular situation, sometimes it's very difficult to join you know, a union. So all those fundamental rights, in fact, they are really very, very key for refugees because of the higher risk of violations. We see that they rarely benefit from equal treatment in employment, hence the importance of those instruments also on discrimination and equal remuneration. They are also frequently in low-skilled, precarious employment sectors that are sometimes excluded completely from the national labor laws. So even more at risk of those fundamental rights violations. And sometimes they face multiple discrimination issues that put them much more at risk of fundamental rights violation. So it's very important to look at how can we support governments, employers, workers to actually realize those rights, because they are a bit the basis for decent work, for the full realization of decent work and the other rights, the other labor rights. Okay, so each of those fundamental rights, they would require, you know, a full session of discussion with you to really get your views and share, you know, the full concept. But we decided today to focus on two of them that are particularly relevant in context of this displacement. The first one is that I will deal with is forced labor. So how would you describe forced labor in your mind? What is the situation of forced labor? Anything that comes to mind when you think about forced labor in displacement context? What does that look like? Yes, Anna?
Yes, I'm sorry. I just see that nobody is raising their hand. So, so I would say that first is probably the child labor. So because children usually don't want to work, but maybe from the just this saying, this is just if their employment is also not meaningful. So if it doesn't correspond to the qualifications of the refugee, I don't know if this could be considered as a forced labor or not. So here is very interesting to hear just your opinion and how it is in the laws.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, there are a lot of the elements that you mentioned in forced labor situations. I like to show this graph first to show you that, you know, at the ILO, we speak a lot about this concept of decent work, work that is done in freedom, with consent, with dignity. And when we think about forced labor, it's basically, you know, the opposite of decent work. So on one side, you have decent employment for refugees. And on the other side, you have forced labor situation. And in the middle, you can have, you know, violations of labor rights. You can have minor violation, you can have severe violations. But for example, you were mentioning, I think, non-payment of wages. We have situations where we see that, for example, refugees are not paid their wages. That does not mean that they are in forced labor. Forced labor, it's a specific definition. It's and the concept is that first, you do not give your informed consent. So, you know, you could have been abducted. There are some situations of really physical violence, but there are also a lot of situations of deception. You know, you were tricked into a job. We were telling you these will be the conditions of the work, and in fact, you discovered these are other conditions. So you do not give fully your informed consent because there is an element of deception or of coercion. And in addition to that, you cannot leave the job for many different reasons. It can be physical coercion again, but this is not the majority of the cases. The majority of the cases of forced labor, they cannot leave the job because the employers will not pay wages for several months and tell the workers, the refugee workers, for example, I will, if you leave now, I will not pay you the last 6 months. So stay a bit longer. So, there are some threats. Or if you leave now, in fact, I didn't renew your work permit. You do not have a proper work permit. So I'm going to denounce you to the authorities. You will be detained and sent back. Or so different type of threats that we see. So it's really those two elements of, you do not give your consent, informed consent, and in addition, you cannot leave because there is a penalty. If you leave, this penalty will fall on you. You will not be paid. You will be denounced to authorities, etc., etc. So I wanted to give you just a short overview, of the situation those days. And unfortunately, when we speak about displacement context, we don't really have the full picture because data is still very much missing. So today, there's approximately 28 million people that are still in forced labor, adults and children. And you can see on the screen that among those, you have the vast majority of people who are in forced labor are in what we call forced labor exploitation. There are also some people that are in forced commercial sexual exploitation. And we still have some people that are in forced labor that is imposed by states. But this is not really interesting us a lot because this is not the situation in many displacement contexts. But there are still countries where, people are forced, for example, to practice, to build roads. Otherwise, they would lose social benefits. So they are imposed by the state. But the vast majority of people, 86% are in forced labor that is imposed by private actors, by either employers or private employers or companies. The problem is that in those numbers, we cannot tell today how many of those total are in displacement context, and we still need to continue to disaggregate our data in our future global estimations. But what I wanted to show you, also to give you a bit more a detailed understanding of how forced labor happen, is that we know that there are some regions where either the prevalence of forced labor or the actual total number of victims is pretty high. So Asia and the Pacific is the region where there are the highest total number of victims. And the Arab states is the region where the prevalence is the highest, meaning the number of people, per 1,000 people, per 1,000 workers in forced labor is the highest. So we can also see that some of those regions, host a large number of refugees and IDPs and are more at risk to look at for violations of forced labor. We also know, and that's quite interesting, that, compared to other fundamental rights violation, for example, most of child labor situation, it happens in low-income countries. It's very linked to poverty, etc. But when we look at forced labor, this is really not the case. It's a completely different picture. In fact, we see that half of forced labor, 50% of cases, they are in either upper middle or high income countries, which are also countries that host also large, some populations of refugees. And so it's not because the refugee or the worker is hosted in a middle income or high income that he or she has less risk to be in forced labor. On the contrary, we still see that there are a lot of issues specifically linked to migration. and the fact that workers are tricked into forced labor because often of their vulnerability as a migrant. So to keep really this in mind also in our work. And lastly, what we see is that, in fact, forced labor issues, it touches really all sectors, but there are sectors that are more touched. I mean, services, it's also one of the biggest sectors worldwide. So we have to also, compare it to the total number of workers in those sectors. But services, hospitality, small restaurants, other services are very touched by the phenomenon. Manufacturing, construction, agriculture, domestic work, mining and quarrying are some of the sectors with the higher incidence of forced labor worldwide. Of course, what we see from here when we look inside the statistics is that the people most at risk, and this also applies to refugees, are low-skilled workers. Because of all the vulnerabilities that they have that are linked to, the job, they are much more at risk than middle-skilled or obviously high-skilled workers. What we can also see is that migrant workers are 3 times more at risk to fall into forced labor than a local national worker. So for now, this is a very shocking statistic because it shows you really that as soon as you quit your country, your chances of being in a forced labor situation are much, much higher. And this is linked to recruitment processes, lack of protections in the host countries when it comes to labor protections. But in those statistics, there are only the refugees that are in normal household settings that are taken into account. Unfortunately, those statistics do not reflect the situation of refugees that live in camps, for example. So this is really something we need also to look at much more closely in the future. To have a much better understanding of also the situation of refugees that are not in normal household settings. But migration is definitely a big vulnerability factor. What we also see is that there are migrants that are especially at risk. It's not all migrants or all refugees. It's often when they are first time in a foreign country with low literacy in low paid sectors. What we see is that also people in irregular situations obviously have much more chances to be in forced labor because there are also much more leverages from unscrupulous employers to use to coerce someone who is in an irregular situation than someone who is in a regular work situation into forced labor. And also people who are under contract with what we call private employment agencies. So, the contract is with these employment agencies and not with the actual employer. And this creates a lack of transparency even for the employer to understand, okay, are labor rights respected? Are wages paid? How is this person accommodated, etc.? And this distance really creates further vulnerabilities for workers to be abused. Before we go into more of a discussion, I wanted to also show you who has heard about the term trafficking in persons. You can just put your hand, the yellow hand, if you've ever heard about the term trafficking in persons, human trafficking, trafficking in human beings. There's several terms for it. Emily, Anna, you've heard about it. Anyone else has heard about trafficking? It's an important term because sometimes people ask us, but what is the difference between forced labor and trafficking in person? Is it the same? Is it different? So I just wanted to clarify that when we speak about forced labor or trafficking in displacement context, most of the concepts, like the bulk of it, it's the same thing. So when we spoke about trafficking for labor exploitation or trafficking for sexual exploitation, we can say that this is similar to forced labor issues. There are a few exceptions on both sides where we say a few cases of forced labor are not trafficking. And this is cases of forced labor imposed by states. This has nothing to do with trafficking in persons because this is really linked to a state system. So this is the exception of forced labor cases that are not trafficking. And on the other side, there are a few trafficking cases that are not forced labor. And this is, trafficking for removal of organs or trafficking for forced marriage or trafficking for adoption. These are issues of trafficking that have nothing to do with work. So it's not linked to forced labor. But all the other situations, and they are the majority of them, they are pretty much the same. So the concepts are very, very close. Any question here? Or is that clear?
Alix, I don't know if you can see the chat, but perhaps because you share your screen, you cannot. But there were some comments to previous slides from Arik and Emily, so I already thanked them. Can you see the chat or?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
I can see
So
it
I just
now.
wanted
Sorry,
to know
I was
that.
not focusing on it.
No, sorry, just to know. Okay, thank you. So if anybody cannot take the floor, they can also use the chat.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay, so now to finish the session on forced labor, I wanted to tell you a bit more and discuss together how do we actually detect from forced labor from happening? Because we do a lot of work with governments, with employers, with trade unions, with workers on how to better detect those situations. And especially in displacement contexts where there are additional challenges of detection, so that we can prevent them in the future and address cases that are happening. I've already asked the question a bit before of how forced labor really manifests in displacement contexts. Do you happen to know specific cases, or did you come through cases of, extreme labor exploitation? Emily and Anna, I think you want to share.
Yes. So maybe I first would like to tell just the reflection to your first question. So these three that are listed here. So just my first reflection is that there should be more awareness raising of people, of refugees about this. So because even now I would say that it's not enough awareness raising. For example, there is not usually that leaflet could be placed in, I don't know, in the registration authority or in social support service. So if the leaflets, if the posters are there, then it is more awareness raising, and these are less cases. And then also refugees should feel, so to say, open to share, because I made a survey among Ukrainian refugees in Switzerland, and one of my questions in the survey was, did you face any discrimination? Some people answered yes, but these were not so many answers that they really faced. So therefore, I don't know if people are just not sharing, or if they really didn't face, because sometimes people are really afraid to say. And my second thing that I wanted to share is about trafficking. When I worked in Ukraine, so it was even I would say somewhere in 2014 or 15 that Switzerland still supported the program of IOM on human trafficking. So even that time when there were no, so to say, too much war, so trafficking was still present. But I remember that when the full-scale war started, that time there were really leaflets distributed widely about the trafficking, because when people were crossing the border, and I even happened to hear some personal cases from people when they just at the last moment even identified that it was trafficking, that they were invited to go to another bus. And so at that time they identified, and again they identified because there was awareness raising. And therefore I would here highlight that awareness raising is probably number one. If people are aware, then less human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's extremely important point. And it's exactly refers to the fact that this is a crime that sometimes is a bit vague. People do not, most of the victims of forced labor and trafficking in person, they don't realize they are in fact victims. So it's how do you raise this awareness also in those populations that are at risk, so that if they are in this situation, they will actually complain and realize that something is really wrong. Detection is very difficult, and that's why I completely agree that we should put a lot of focus on how to actually bring awareness on this to populations at risk. Thank you for sharing. Emily?
Thank you for the presentation. And I think I had quite a similar intervention as Anna about awareness, but maybe to answer a bit the other question, do you think a person needs to have bras or skirts to be a victim of forced labor? I think no, absolutely not, because I think often there's other way of pressuring people, and I can think about the example of trafficking, as Anna mentioned about the bus, where people were maybe not aware, but then maybe they get some support and some threat about not denouncing the exploitative situation, or even I know in some countries sometimes the employer take the passport of the person or any like ID documents, or like just treat them to denounce them to local authorities. And I think awareness is really important, because sometimes people don't even know their rights in the country, and they don't really know what they can do. They're in living in fear, and I think that can just make the exploitative situation continue. And even if they have credit card or like cell phones, I think it's really tricky situation, because I think they are not always aware of how it's exploitation. And even if they are, I think something is not normal, I think they are very in vulnerable situation, and they can be really fearful of their implication and repercussion of communicating this. So yeah, I think maybe that was a bit my reflection on the question.
Thanks for sharing. It's really excellent point, because with other fundamental rights at work, for example, child labor, already it's a bit more visible. So you go next to an agricultural field and you can see young children in the field. You visualize it. A lot of victims of forced labor today, I pass through a construction site in Switzerland, I might not see that the person is in forced labor, although this person is. It's not something that you see with your eyes, and there's a lot of misconception about the crime, because often, we have those past images of the slavery as, during colonial times, or where physically we were seeing people forced. But now most of the situation, again, are not, as you mentioned, physical, violence, or, physical evidence that the person is in forced labor. Of course, there are still those cases, but it's not the majority of them. So that's why what we created is indicators of forced labor. And these are just, if you want, red signs that should prompt you to investigate further whether you are or not in a situation of forced labor. I see, Hanan, you had also something you wanted to share.
Yes, this is Hanan Hamadi. I have one question regarding currently I'm working with the migrant workers in Lebanon with MSF Médecins Sans Frontières. During the war in Lebanon last year, many migrant workers were prevented by their employers from leaving the house, while the employers themselves fled the country. Okay, and these migrant workers were afraid and didn't know what to do. So they contacted their friends, their relatives in Lebanon, who tried to evacuate them through organizations. That this matter, under which category can this type of action be classified through this course?
Thank you for this. I mean, of course, we will need to look a bit deeper at the situation, but already, you know, if the employer is not paying the worker and, you know, abandoning the worker, as you mentioned, without proper termination of employment, possible indemnities, you know, as per the Lebanese labor law. So here you would have also a violation of just the contract in terms of fulfillment of the contract. Now I don't hear elements of really forcing them to stay in the job. I think it was more a case of abandonment and non-payment of wages and non-fulfillment of the contract. But in certain Middle East countries, including in Lebanon, there is also the sponsorship system. You might be aware of this, which in fact, the worker depends on an employer for the work permits. And this can really facilitate forced labor from happening. For example, when employers will retain the passports, not pay the workers, etc. But
yes, because they enter, usually they enter to Lebanon through kafala system.
Yes. And our committee of experts is in fact mentioning that the kafala system is facilitating forced labor. So there are some negative elements that make a worker completely dependent on the employer, where, if you threaten the person, I will denounce you to the immigration authorities if you do not continue to work over time. Then the person knows that he depends so much on this employer that it's forcing her to stay in the job. So it's facilitating those elements of coercion, for sure. I think, unfortunately, we are arriving at the end also of our time. So I just wanted to summarize what you see on the screen is what we call these indicators of forced labor. Which are really red flags for a situation. And you can see that you have restriction of movement, as you just mentioned, also Hanan, abuse of vulnerability, especially of the refugee status, and those vulnerable situations, contract deception, so lies about terms and conditions, withholding of wages, isolation, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, retention of ID papers, debt bondage, also linked often to recruitment, abusive working and living condition, and excessive overtime. I think that in the future, it would be really great if we can adapt this to displacement context to be even more specific of the different cases. But this is already very valid for displacement context. So these are good indication of where situation might be completely abusive. And lastly, I will just leave you to look better maybe at our Protocol 29, which is a very good instrument that lay down really the approach of the ILO when it comes to supporting government workers and employers, including in displacement context, to fight forced labor. And our ILO committee of experts has also commented a lot on situations of forced labor of refugees, highlighting very important elements of what should the response be. For example, with awareness, the importance of awareness raising, the importance of looking at both situation of labor abuse, but also sexual abuse, the importance of strengthening the capacity of labor inspectors to detect those cases, also in situation of displacement. You will see, Anna, that the Committee of Experts highlighted awareness-raising activities in the context of Ukraine. So I think that's what also you were referring to. And the last point, maybe last point of the presentation, in the context of Aruba, there was also a comment of our Committee of Experts that says that obstacles to accessing asylum and regularization, they in fact contribute to increase the vulnerabilities and risk of exploitation and forced labor. So we really need to look at this also from this angle of how can the lack of regularization process really contribute to putting people at risk, and how can we work on addressing those situations. Thank you very much. I hope it gave you a snapshot. I know it's quite quick, but if you have any other questions, I will also look at the chat in the coming minutes to answer anything. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alix, and thank you to the participants who could make a lot of added value in the chat and with their interventions. So thank you so much. Yes, indeed, it's probably this 45 minute sessions is quite short for this kind of topic. So I would let Ariane or Francesca take the floor now. I don't know who's starting on the FAO side. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marion, and thank you, Alix. So indeed, we're moving on to the presentation of FAO. I am actually not sure who of you know well FAO and its mandate. So just to clarify or to give you some introductory useful information, FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the main mandate is about the promotion of sustainable agriculture and eradicating hunger and rural poverty. So those are the main objectives of this UN specialized agency. And by agriculture, maybe also something important to provide you with as a definition. We don't mean only crop farming, because people usually think of agriculture as only, cocoa, cotton, and those kind of crop and commodities, while the definition of agriculture is much broader. And so when we will say agriculture or presentation, please bear that in mind, that agriculture encompasses crop farming, fisheries, aquaculture, livestock, and forestry. So it's quite a broad sector. And this remains the main sector of employment for children in child labor situation. And this is a persistent trend over the last 20 years, more or less. The International Labour Organization and lately also UNICEF are releasing jointly data on child labor on a regular basis. The next one are expecting this year and the next year. And this represents still more than 110 million children that are in child labor. A good portion of them are in hazardous work, and we will look at what does that mean, both child labor and hazardous work. The main regions where you will encounter child labor are Africa and Asia. It is a global phenomenon. Unfortunately, you will find children in child labor both in developing and in developed countries. but still, those are the two regions hosting the majority of children in child labor, especially in agriculture. In the next slide, just to give you a bit more contents about FAO, and also what's the global policy framework on child labor in agriculture in displacement context. So first of all, as we said before, child labor is mostly found in agriculture. But displacement context, humanitarian context, are unfortunately heightening and intensifying situations of child labor. Children who were already in child labor will find themselves in even more hardship. And where children were not in child labor, they will be pushed into child labor because of the displacement context, because of the humanitarian context. So at country level, you have indicators that allow to activate what we call the system to cope with humanitarian context. No? So I give you an example. For instance, when you have a food insecurity situation in some countries, we have different levels of alerts. This indicator of food security is not the only one to apply to qualify a humanitarian context. And most of the cases where you will have refugees or internally displaced people, it will be the case in humanitarian contexts. No? It's not all the cases, but it is often the case that you will have humanitarian context. And in those humanitarian contexts, you have specific principles that apply, not to be able to save lives and to safeguards also fundamental rights, including fundamental rights at work. In the case of FAO, we focus on addressing in the case of child labor in agriculture and in the context of food insecurity, no? Because this is part of our mandate and this is where we can have, let's say, an impact with our action. Okay. If we go to the next slide, so why do we need to act on child labor in agriculture in displacement contexts? Well, in general, and even in the case of normal contexts, child labor prevents education, healthy development, and contribute to perpetuating a cycle of poverty for future generations. It's an issue linked with income, production for food security, and food systems. So where there is child labor, there is no sustainable food system because food system rely on children workforce, and so it's not okay. It means that it traps children in what we call low skill or unskilled labor and also informal labor. When we have child labor, we have an obstacle to recovery and resilience in general. So starting point, even in the displacement context and humanitarian context, is securing and increasing household income, reducing rural poverty, securing productivity of agriculture, and reducing through different strategies the dependence on extra labor and income supplied by children. So this requires really an integrated strategy, and we will share with you some of the solutions that we have observed can work in those contexts. And this is what we will see in our session. Now, like you did just before with Alix, with the concept of forced labor and trafficking, we'll go to the key concepts linked with child labor. And over to my colleague, Francesca. Thank you.
Okay. Then when we see an image like this one, we pose ourselves many questions. Is the child in child labor or is working? Is the child how old how old is this child? Is in which country is happening this? Is the child working under the minimum age for employment? Is the task that is performing hazardous? Is part this task of a list that was developed by the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Labor and Social Partners? We will go through all this question to help us to identify if this image represents child work or child labor. We start from this diagram that shows the key relationship between different types of work. Is helpful because if we think about child labor, we can visualize this relationship. The diagram represents the international recognized approach to address harmful work for children, as not all work done by children is harmful and should be eliminated. It is important to have this understanding to understand the differences between what is child work and what is child labor. The orange, light orange circle encompasses all economic activities undertaken by children under 18 years of age, including what is also is produced for the family, for the market, is services for the or news for others, is informal employment. And the children are working full-time or around the school hours. This is what can happen in children economic activities and is child work. Child work is not should not be eliminated, but include also all form of acceptable work, but also include in the other circle what we call unacceptable work. It is include child labor and the worst form of child labor. Then the child labor, the child labor include the worst form of child labor. We say with the Alix presentation, we identify the worst form of child labor all as a all form of slavery or practices similar to slavery, the use of offering a child for prostitution, for example, is the list that is included in the Convention 182 of the International Labour Organization about the worst form of child labor, and include also a particular form of worst form of child labor, that is the work which by its nature or the circumstances in which is carried out is likely to harm the health, development, safety or moral of a child. It also is known as hazardous work. The hazardous work or hazardous child labor, how we want to call it, is highlighted here because we give a high significance in the agricultural work in crisis setting. Most of the children are found in the hazardous child labor. Okay. The International Labour Organization, as we saw in the previous presentation, in the Convention 138, adopted in 1973, set standard for the minimum age of employment. This guides us in this definition of child labor. Child labor is the work that engages children who are too young and below the minimum employment age. Is mentally, physically, spiritually, socially, and morally dangerous and harmful to children, and interferes with compulsory schooling. Then this is the child labor should be eliminated. One of the most common sectors where child labor exists is agriculture. However, not all work in agriculture can be classified as child labor, and then the distinction depends on the child age. If they are legally, they reach the minimum age for employment, the type of work and task which is performed, if they are carrying heavy loads, they are using dangerous tools or chemicals, or they are working on hazardous condition, and the hours of work and working condition in general. Child labor is a violation of human rights and must be eliminated. when to understand what is child labor, we use two main conventions from ILO, and then they guide us, the Convention 138, the Convention 182, to understand, based on child age, to determine whether the work the children are engaged is considered acceptable, light work, or hazardous work, and then child labor. According to the Convention 138, the minimum age for admission to employment should not be less than the age of completion of compulsory schooling. In case, not less than 15 years. However, exceptions exist depending on national circumstances or economic conditions. These apply to all children that are in a territory, in a state. Even it applied to the children that are refugees, that are displaced from other country. If we go, we break down by age group to understand what kind of work is acceptable or what crosses the line into child labor, we got and see that we make it the differences between age group, and then the first age group represent the children between 5 and 11 years, and then here are possible for those children only safe and educational tasks. At this stage of their life, the children should not be working in any way that affect their health, education, or well-being. And they can engage only in safe, supervised activities that they contribute to learning. And any work must be done under the supervision of an adult and under an educational program. They can help around the house, but for less than 1 hour per week, for example. Then we pass to a second category that is the children age between 12 and 13. And we call this light work. Light work means that the children older, they can begin to do it, some activities such as assisting the family business or performing small tasks that should not harm their development. Such work must comply with the defined national law that regulate light work for this age group, no more than 14 hours per week. It cannot interfere with the schooling or their education, and not be hazardous work or working, for example, at night. The Article 7 guides us in what is light work, and say that the national law may allow light work for children between 12, 13, or young as 11 in some developing countries, under strict conditions, and then should respect this, the strict conditions should respect the fact that they should be regulated by law, the activity, and then the list of activities that are permitted, and then they should not be more than 14 hours per week. And then we have the third category, that is the category where the children, they reach already the legal age for full employment, that the country the country adopt. And normally the legal working age start, there are differences between the states, but all the states, they must comply with the 14 or 15, 17 years old, depending on national economy and context. At this stage, the children can be employed, but there are very important restriction and protection for those children. The work must not be hazardous. This means that they should not be exposed to physical and emotional harm. The condition should be safe and fair in support of their development. If this doesn't happen, the children with the legal age for full employment are in child labor. If this condition apply, those children are in decent work situation, and then they can fully enjoy the work. This is comply with the ILO Convention 182 that focus on eliminating the worst form of child labor, including hazardous work, the Article 3. And then we have the last category of age group that include the adults, that young adults that are between 18 and 24 years old. Those young adults, they can work. They can including tasks that expose them to hazardous work, and they fully enjoy all the protection that are made by national law. Then we talk about what is hazardous work. Let's say that it is important to say that hazardous work is prohibited to all girls or boys under 18 by the Convention 182. And then the hazardous work is the work which by its nature or by the circumstances in which is carried out is likely to harm the health and safety or moral of children. What constitutes work which is by nature is the definition is determined nationally in a government-led process in a tripartite consultation that decide the list, the child labor, the national hazardous work list that reflect the unique and economic and social condition of each country. Then there is a list that is established at national level and decide which work is hazardous by its nature. Normally is there are consideration about use of certain machinery, is exposure to toxic chemicals, or work that is underwater or certain sectors. And then there is another determinant of what is hazardous work, is the work which is by their circumstances is hazardous for children with an acceptable level of risk. Is determined, this one, not at national level, but at workplace level. And then hazardous work is one of the category of child labor that is considered the worst form of child labor, and it should be eliminated as a matter of urgency. In agriculture, the nature of the task itself sometimes may not always be hazardous, but the condition under which it's carried out sometimes can quickly turn the activity into hazardous work. For example, a task like fruit picking may seem to be harmless, but the condition can make it hazardous. If a child is working in a field that has been sprayed with the chemicals, for example, or if they are doing this work far from their parents or guardians at night or for long hours, this situation, these circumstances bring the child from a situation of child work to a situation of child labor. Hazardous work in agriculture, after a crisis, whether for natural disaster or conflict, normally there is also an urgent need for an immediate attention for the risk faced by the children in the agricultural work. And family normally they struggle to recover. Children often are forced into work that put their health and safety and future at risk. This can, for example, expose some children during crisis to illegal movement of goods in this dangerous environment, conflict over access to seeking alternative sources of food, water, firewood, for example. When community face food insecurity, for example, children are often forced to work longer hours under hazardous conditions. The increase for the production, the use of pesticides and chemicals, they're exposed children to those chemicals and pesticides if they're forced to work. The outbreaks of animal diseases also, they can be transmitted to humans. They can influence no, put a major exposure to risk to hazardous work for children. After natural disaster, for example, children may face a physical risk. They can carry heavy loads over long distances in dangerous situation, of working on extreme environmental condition. They can lose the community that they lost their infrastructure, productive assets. They can put children, involve children in performing hazardous tasks in the reconstruction efforts. And the rapid growth and the large-scale responses normally in this situation can expose children to significant risk. Then in this situation, it is a priority to recognize this risk and eliminate hazardous work in certain responses in the work in agriculture, especially in post-crisis environment, to protect children. Why is exposure to work hazard especially bad for children? Children are not little adults. They are greater risk than adults. They're developing their body, they're developing, and then they are more susceptible to injuries. For example, child bones and muscles and organs are not fully formed, which make them more vulnerable to physical stress. Children, lungs, and respiratory system are still developing, making them more sensitive to toxic fume, dust, hazardous chemical in the workplace, in the community where they're working. Exposure to pesticide, fumes, and other pollutants, they can have a lasting damage in their breathing overall health. Children are still at a critical stage of physical and mental development, and exposure to hazardous condition can not only harm their body, but also they interfere with their cognitive development, emotional well-being, and the work sometimes expose them to stress or trauma that they can have long-lasting negative effect on their development. What seems a simple task for an adult may pose significant danger to a child who cannot recognize the hazard, for example, that is involved in that task. Then we are a snapshot of what is the physical vulnerability and exposure to pesticide for children in the community, but also normally in the post-crisis responses and the agricultural program that sustain food security program sometimes. Children, we say that children are still developing their mind and their body, and they take more toxic droplet, vapors, and dust. Children organs are less able to detoxify pesticides, and the effect of the chemicals on the body of the child that can damage organs. And the children's, also the hormonal system. Children behavior also increase the likelihood of ingesting pesticide while they're playing on the floor, for example, even if they are not, it's not an exposure that happen because they're employed, or because if they are working on another task, they can put or play, they can put their hand to mouth behavior, they can put with the hand, they can put what they touch in their mouth. Children, they have a lower capacity to assess risk because they're children. There is a natural development process. They cannot recognize the risk where they are close to places where they can be exposed to pesticide. The exposure to pesticide, this is represent the work of FAO, in protecting children from exposure to pesticides. It can happen at different stage level, from the cell point to the cleaning, washing the clothes that they were used to apply pesticides, but also can be an antenatal exposure of the children, and environmental exposure. We have different kind of exposure. One can be acute, it can show the sign very early in the short term. And then we have a low dose that bring long-term exposure, also that bring effect after a long time, and is connected with this situation. Then we say that to children, it is applied also in the case of children that are refugees or are away from their community. Children can be exposed to pesticide at home, at play, and at work. Pardon, it's not working. Okay. Then after this, the definition and then the key concept about child labor, we saw that it's not easy in practice to, even if we base our judgment and our work based on the application of an international convention, to draw a line between what is permissible activity and what is child labor. We saw that we must take into consideration the child age, the hours, the condition of work, the activities that are performed, and the hazard which are exposed to the children, and that should not be in interference with the compulsory education. If this line is trespassed, there is a situation of child labor. Then we go for a game. If there is a session that I can leave you sometimes to go through the question, but the idea is to interact with you if possible. And based on 3 cases, we have 3 children and with different stories. And there is a question under each child. And I would like to hear from you if you consider this child labor, child work, or the worst form of child labor. I can give you a few minutes. I cannot see the screen, unfortunately, but if there is any, you can write in the chat, but if you can raise your hand and we can talk.
Thank you, Francesca. So you said you cannot see the chat, no?
No, now I can open the chat because
okay.
Okay.
Because there was Anna was writing, but also Ariane answered. So anybody else would like to answer now the exercise? Please don't be shy.
Marion, just to respond to the second question live of Anna.
Yes, sure.
Will the age of digitalization have an impact basically on the definition of child labor? The answer is basically maybe, but for now, it remains valid. No, if countries universally have set national laws to define what is the minimum age for, or the minimum years of education, it is retained as a progress, no? This kind of really universal adoption of a minimum education for children in every country. So a 10-year-old who would write codes and earn money, there are derogations in some countries, for instance, for artistic activities. So children who are actors, for instance, they can engage in remunerated activities. There are some possibility and derogation, let's put it like that. But I just would like really to insist that most child labor is children who work in terrible conditions, and most of them are in agriculture. They are also, of course, working in other sectors like construction, mining, but we are really talking about activities that for now, for which we do not see the potential, let's say, of digitalization or AI on them. For agriculture, the efforts over the last decades to mechanize agriculture have been very important, but have not led, unfortunately, to a decrease in child labor. So yes, just to give you a little bit more of a really global context and where is the bulk of children in child labor, so in really, really bad working conditions. And there is the quiz, but Francesca, if you agree, just because we are running a little bit late, I would propose to, of course, people who have had the time to look at the definition, their contribution in the chat are most welcome. But maybe we can move on with the presentation. Thank you.
Yes. Then we talk about risk and vulnerability. Children in displaced setting. I will close or read the chat, otherwise I cannot see the presentation. Children in a displaced setting due to a conflict or natural disaster or economic hardship, they face heightened risk of being drawn into child labor. The various factors they can pull children into work, meaning that family of children themselves, they see it is as a necessary or opportune to their situation. This factor often arise due to the economic instability, family circumstances, or disrupted social structure. For example, when family they lose their income, safety, home, child labor may see as a solution to financial hardship. Without a decent work for adult, family may feel they have no choice but to rely on children earnings, for example. For example, also the death, departure, or disability of a family member can place an heavy burden on children. When children are alone, they also must provide for themselves, making them vulnerable to harmful work. Children are also often step in as a caregivers or wage earner when adults cannot longer work. In rural community, agricultural losses force family to seek alternative way to secure food and income. Children help on farms, tend livestock, or they sell goods, or sometimes also they work under hazardous conditions. Also, this happens when schools are damaged or they don't have access to school, the children that are displaced, and education is not accessible for them sometimes. Children may drop out work instead. Displacement also due to conflict, disaster, or the economic crisis forces family to move. And then sometimes the children, they are migrating alone in another direction with different pattern in search of work. These families, they prioritize survival over education, and the children, they lead. They have no other choice but to look work to support the younger sibling, for example, that they stay at home with them. After displacement, also family may be unaware of child labor law of the hosting country, for example, or protection in their new location. And they may also may not know also that child work is illegal at that age or for that nature, no, because it's part of hazardous child labor list. And then employers may take advantage of this legal uncertainty to exploit child workers. These are all pull factors. And then we have also the push factors that are factors that they come from the employers industry or external condition that they create the opportunities for children to work, especially in post-crisis situation. After a conflict, natural disaster or economic crisis, there are a surge in demand in labor in construction, for example, in agriculture, in informal work. Industries may turn to children when adult labor is insufficient or expensive in these conditions. Also, the disability and migration of adult workers, they lead to labor shortage, they making children cheap, easy, available workforce. The employers may employ displaced children in low skills, informal job where adult workers are not available. In crisis situations, some employers also they offer food, shelters, and education. No? However, these arrangements often lead to unfair conditions and bonded labor. Aid-driven economies also they create a high demand for adult workers and logistic, food distribution, so rebuilding effort. And when adult labor is insufficient, children, they may be recruited, especially in informal agriculture work with the small business, informal business. And when children struggle to meet their basic need also, hazardous labor in dangerous sector, call them like construction, mining, agriculture, they might be push into these sectors. Then post-crisis instability often leads to weak governance, and authorities might lack resources to monitor workplace or enforce child labor law. This slide represents what are the risk factors and the protective factors that they bring at a different level. We start from the bottom where we find a child and all the risk factors that affect in a situation of crisis the child, and then they are out of combining school or training, large education gap, they are on the move, violence, illness, disability in the family. They are married, divorced, abandoned adolescent girls. All these risk factors, they bring the child to a situation where they are vulnerable. And then in the column on the right, there are the protective factors that we must see in the response where we are addressing the risk factor for this target group that is, for example, the child. The protective factor that we must work on is to see the child in a school or training. They have give them access to light or decent work, time to play, positive relation with parents, life skills, and legal status and documentation. Then if we move up, we see also the same risk factor, a protective factor for the family. And then the family, they can be in displacement status, lack of childcare, then domestic violence, lack of available adult work. And then the protective factor that can guide us in our response to reduce the risk of child labor can bring us like the presence of both parents and caregiver, for example, can be a protective factor at this level of intervention, access to basic services and information for the family, positive value placed on education at the family level in the household, adequate and safe income for the family. When we move to the bigger, to the community, we see that there is during the risk crisis, displacement of movement of persons, we see that there is a disruption of protection system, insecurity and discrimination, and limited access to light, decent work for adolescents, for example. And then what we can insert in our response, in our design, in our work is create the protective environment that promote the availability of quality education, strong support structures, a protection system, community organization to work with children and services for people with disability or impairment, for example. They can bring in a protective factor that reduce the risk of child labor. And then when we move to the society, we have the macro level, then the risk factor, food insecurity also a child recruitment and armed groups, overstretched formal system and services that they cannot perform in such a situation well, a large informal economy with unregulated work, access restriction to formal labor market. What we would we can promote through our work is social protection and safety nets, functional child labor monitoring system that they can prevent situation, and they can support also the implementation of regular prevention mitigation measure during our work, strong and inclusive labor legal framework that they are the base for a work on child labor, and accessible and child-friendly services for children. Then is over from my side, and I will leave the floor to Ariane.
We are entering the last part now of the presentation. We realize that we're a bit over time, so we will be selective in what we show you. But so, like we said at the beginning of this presentation, refugees, internationally displaced person, forcibly displaced population, most of the time this happen in the context of humanitarian contexts, no? And so there is an opportunity for humanitarian programming to actually propose solution to child labor. For instance, when you have humanitarian settings, you have multiple sectors that will collaborate. You have, for instance, the sector of food security, of livelihoods, of protection, education, health, nutrition, gender-based violence, and all those sectors are trying their best in those challenging circumstances to provide to population and displaced population all those minimal services, no? So linked with health, nutrition, food security, protection, education, etc. And you have opportunity to make the best for preventing or addressing child labor in the context of this collaboration across sectors. It can be through coordination, so like having joint briefings, access to training really on child labor, intra or intersectoral dialogue, to have a joint referral pathways regarding child labor. You could have a joint position. It could be part of the crisis response. And for this one, since we have also a participant from Lebanon, no, child labor, at least in the past, used to be part of a Lebanon crisis response plan, no? So you had all humanitarian actors collaborating to also respond to child labor that was rampant in agriculture. In terms of situation analysis and assessment, very often in the context of humanitarian crisis, you will have a lack of consistent data on child labor, or the need at least for more in-depth information. So there can be a collaboration to do that, to at least collect some quality data or limited quantity data on proxy related to child labor. So for instance, school dropouts, how many children of school going age or not attending school, including through among the registered IDP and refugee community, how to develop jointly some tools, some methodology of observation, at least sampling, that would help us to generate more information on where children work, what kind of tasks they conduct, and what we can do about it. No, key child labor indicators, as we saw, they include the age, the days, the hours of work, the tasks, and the nature of conditions of work, but also the school attendance. There are also opportunities really to work together through program design and implementation. And of course, to include points under monitoring and evaluation is key, no, to ensure that child labor is covered in the context of a humanitarian crisis. In the next slide, I just wanted to touch upon a very specific example, just to share a specific case for FAO to engage on the topic of child labor in the context of a refugee crisis. We supported the government from 2015 to address the issue of child labor in agriculture in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, no? And what we know is that even before the Syrian crisis, the agricultural sector of Lebanon was very informal. Agriculture is a sector that remained very small scale. So with really small plots of land in Lebanon, still a tradition, but Lebanon mostly depend from imports, to meet the food needs. And with the sudden increase of population, now with the influx of Syrian refugees, you had really, unfortunately, all the ingredients to have a sudden surge of children in child labor, because you have Syrian adult workforce who was not allowed anymore to work in agriculture, which had been the case previous to this period. And so children were, on the other hand, allowed for a certain time to work, even in bad conditions, to meet the demand of agriculture. And so you had really a very bad situation, for which FAO has formulated a multidimensional response, and also trying to work on formalizing agriculture as a sector, but also to respond to the food insecurity and the food crisis behind child labor in both refugee population, but also in host population, and to understand what were exactly the different reasons behind children working in the agricultural sector of Lebanon. So it's just to give you the example of a very complex situation that unfortunately has been further complexified or exacerbated by the economic crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Beirut sport outburst in 2020. Now there has been further hardship. And while there are no new updated data on child labor, we can only fear that this situation is still very bad, both among refugee and displaced communities, but also among Lebanese communities. No. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I will not cover all the points because we just don't have the time, but there are different entry points to address child labor, especially in the context of a humanitarian crisis in agriculture. And for instance, you will see that in the next slide, an entry point is to ensure safeguards are in place in all responses that are put in place, basically in the context of a humanitarian crisis. No, you can, you have as a humanitarian actor to go ahead with this responsibility to play a role in preventing child labor in your operation. And humanitarian actors, especially operating in food security and livelihoods, have to ensure that the solution they are implementing will help to improve families' well-being and not inadvertently increase the demand for child labor, because indeed the crisis can act as a pull factor for children to start working. So programs have to be youth inclusive and to consider the distribution of tasks within a household. So if your program is proposing an income generating activity, to families to secure better their access to food and their access to their basic needs, you have to ensure that this program and this offer of income generation activity does not lead to children covering more responsibilities than they should. No, so there are possibilities to ensure that there are code of conducts, there are safeguarding policies in place, there are monitoring and evaluation survey means to verify that children are not put at risk inadvertently, and that on the contrary, we respect the do no harm principle, no? And we help with those humanitarian answers to prevent and address child labor. One other point that I think is important is that refugees communities and IDP, you will have very often child-headed household, or which means that either children are alone with their siblings, or even if they are with their guardians, their parents, maybe those are injured, they are not able anymore to be the one who are the breadwinners. And so while ideally any children should be able to pursue education, especially for the school going age children, adolescents, those that Francesca was referring to, know that are in theory above the minimum age for employment and that have completed their compulsory education. So mostly this 14, 15 to 17 years old, so below 18, no, because you're a child as long as you're below 18. There should be safe and appropriate opportunities for them to work also in humanitarian context. No? So when there are no other solution, because there are no solution of, for instance, social protection, cash transfer, or any economic support that can be given to those families that are in those situations, then there should be strategy in place to create safe and appropriate opportunities for adolescents, no? As long as they are protected from harm, hazards, violence, there are possibilities. So there are possibilities to promote income-generating activities in agriculture that will be safe, that can also promote the acquisition of skills and knowledge that can be used later on also for different kind of occupational activities, no? But just wanted to underline that because very often in humanitarian programming, there is a gap in addressing the needs of those child-headed households where we think of young people who are already adults, but not of children, and was very specific and very urgent situation to be addressed. Francesca, if you don't mind me, I would go directly to the slide on drought on reducing driver of conflict over natural resources, maybe to accelerate a little bit, if that's okay. Super. And yeah, I think that when you have a sudden influx of population in a given country, or if the reason behind this movement is due to a climate change effect, you have in both cases tensions over access to natural resources, which means access to water, but also access to forest products, wood, etc., all elements that are absolutely essential for domestic consumption in rural areas. And children face greater risk in the collection of natural resources. No crisis compromises their access, their safe access to those resources. It damages infrastructure, and so children are more exposed to violence. There is a scarcity of natural resources that drives conflict in general, and their access is often controlled by military, or in general is used against civilians and population. Yes, intervention that can help to better manage those reduced natural resources are always positive to reduce burden, improve time use of households, and so improve school attendance of children. For instance, in FAO, but of course also have other agricultural stakeholders operating in humanitarian context, you can apply this solution, that is to develop a multiple use water system or irrigation program that account for domestic and agricultural uses for livestock, crops and communities, habitats for fish, provide water close to affected households. So there are strategies to design water-related responses, irrigation program also in those contexts that will have actually potentially a very good effect on addressing, preventing child labor. Any solution that help to reducing traveling distance or also or to have prevent children from having to access themselves towards natural resources are very positive. And I just wanted to give you a very specific example because we figured that maybe in the context of this crisis, you don't always think about that. Now, when we talk about climate change effect or shock or crisis, actually it will have a huge effect on livestock. And livestock still represent an enormous font of food security and income and livelihoods for a lot of rural population. No? So in the example of South Sudan, where you had a drought, no, and it's in general, unfortunately, a regular slow onset climate shock that this country encounter, you will have a productivity drop with reduced water and so reduced grazing availability. So really food for animals. That leads herders, so nomadic communities, to migrate further and to undertake transboundary also migration, which becomes a bit less safe. And this seasonal migration in search of natural resources can lead to conflict, no, and crises over natural resources. And in those contexts, children are often sent alone as elder boys to guide animals in search of water and grazing and fodder for food and water for their animals. So this leads to a livelihood food crisis with depletion of productive and non-productive assets and destitution. So basically loss of animals and so the main asset of those herders. And in the next slide, I just wanted to show you what was, for instance, a solution adopted by colleagues in South Sudan. So they combined really different and integrated responses with thinking of animal health, with responding to migration and conflict management, and access to natural resources and market and assets management. They put in place a lot of preventive measures, most of them linked, for instance, with those pastoral field schools. And pastoral field schools are, if you want, a different kind of schools, but that are very informal, that are conducted with rural communities, and that help to provide knowledge about a lot of aspects. So how to better manage water, how to better stock your wood or fodder for animals, alternative sources of fodder and food for animals, how to better save money, so saving and loss association can be formed. And this was a strategy that has helped this capacity development and this incentive to form association of credit, loans, and savings. Those are strategies that have helped protect those communities that were facing those regular shocks and were undertaking those forced regular migration. No. And so it has helped to address also child labor. Okay, maybe Francesca, just I'm looking at the clock and I wouldn't like to take too much time because I see that we're a bit over time. Maybe we could go to 31 and increase incentives to attend school. And yeah, okay. Another entry point is in general to increase incentives to attend school, no? So to help offset education costs, losses expense when children go to school and not to work, all of these are strategies that can help. At the same time, and just to respond to one good comment in the chat that I saw earlier, providing incentive to attend school is excellent, but is not sufficient. So you need at the same time to also convince communities and change their mindsets, their approaches and their perception about children engagement in work. So what does it mean? That parents, guardians often rely on children for work because they feel that school is not relevant, will not help them secure a good livelihood, and also because they think that their children are actually learning while working. So there is all work to be done and undertaken to differentiate what is actually learning and what is the difference with child labor and why attending school and actually helping influence, for instance, curriculum to help make them more relevant for rural communities is positive. So all of these are strategies that can be applied in developing contexts, but also in humanitarian contexts to convince families to renounce to child labor. I'm very sorry that we rushed, but I saw that we were very, very time constrained, and I just wanted to say that there are other solutions that are present in the presentation, but some of these solutions you can also find them in a publication that we will now share. And it's this one, it's the guidance note on child labor in agriculture in protected crisis, fragile and humanitarian context that we invite you to download. It will be in the presentation that we will circulate, but you will see it's really a step-by-step guidance providing really a whole lot of strategies in those contexts to also help reduce child labor among refugees and IDPs. And yes, I stop here so that we can also answer some other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to thank Alix, who wrote me a message that she had to go. Thank you very much to Francesca and Ariane. So I don't know if we can take if there is an urgent question, somebody really has there was a lot of material really in the two presentations, and I feel Ariane and Francesca had to skip some slides to rush. It was a lot, probably that would have meant 2 single sessions for sure. So if I don't see any other question, really a big thank you again to Francesca and Ariane and Alix. And I wanted to say that I have seen that some of you have connected only at 3 p.m. Italian time. So I suppose some of you might have not understood that we have changed time in Europe. So I would encourage that you check time again for next Thursday. Because like 5 or 6 participants connected at 3 p.m. Italy time instead of 2, so there might be a problem on this side. Next session we will be so at 2 p.m. Italian time as usual. And let me check. So yes, we have another, I think, very rich session that we prepared this morning with a meeting. It will be on age, gender, and disability inclusion, with 2 colleagues from the ILO and 1 colleague from UNHCR. And at the end of that session, we will also explain the group exercise. And so I advise that you definitely be here or you watch the recording until the end, because the group exercise will be part of your grading for the certificate. So big thank you again to all of you for connecting, for making the session so lively with your questions, both in the chat and live. Thank you to all. Ciao, Ariane and Francesca. Bye to all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.